Welcome to Integral, a podcast production out of the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education at Santa Clara University, exploring the question, is there a common good in our common home? I'm Teresa Ladrigan-Welpley, the director of the Bannan Institutes in the Ignatian Center, and your host for this podcast. We're coming to you from Vary Hall on the campus of Santa Clara, in the heart of Silicon Valley, California. This season of Integral, we're looking at the ways in which issues of economic justice intersect with the question of the common good. Today we'll explore the impact of money on congressional representation. How is economic justice and the common good realized within our democracy today?
Do you think Americans realize how much time their members of Congress are spending raising money?
I don't.
We know that between 2008 and 2012, more than half of the House depended upon donor contributions for half of their campaign revenue, and around a quarter of these members are highly dependent upon out-of-the-district contributions, meaning 60% or more of their campaign receipts from donors are coming from outside of the candidate's home district. This trend is potentially problematic if it interferes with representation.
To unpack these issues, we're joined today by Ann Baker, assistant professor in the Political Science Department at Santa Clara and Bannan Institute Scholar in the Ignatian Center. She teaches courses on American politics, and her present research focuses on money in U.S. politics, particularly its impact on congressional elections and representation, as well as the operations and strategies of political parties and interest groups. Welcome, Ann.
Thanks, Teresa. Over the past 3 decades, the costs of winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives have increased exponentially. Data from the Campaign Finance Institute indicates that in 1986, an average House race cost $360,000. By 2014, the average cost had risen to approximately $1.5 million, which represents an increase of more than 300%. This pattern of rising costs has been mirrored in races for the Senate and the presidency. So why have elections become so expensive? Advertising costs are primarily to blame. This includes the costs of airing political ads on television, radio, online, and in printed mailings to voters. These costs have risen over time, and candidates have to keep getting their message out over many, many months of campaigning. Outside spending by super PACs and other interest group organizations in congressional races may also be contributing to advertising cost hikes. But it is also the case that incumbent candidates go out of their way to raise large amounts of money to ward off would-be challengers, creating an artificial money race in some contests that drives up overall spending. Candidates' need for more and more campaign money has many implications for the health of democracy. In today's podcast, we will examine this issue from several different angles. To start, let's hear from members of Congress about the money race and its impact on their ability to do their jobs. A rare bipartisan bill called the STOP Act was recently introduced in the House by Representative David Jolly, a Republican, and Representative Rick Nolan, a Democrat. The act prohibits federal officials, including members of Congress, from directly soliciting campaign funds. Here is Representative Jolly in a clip from 60 Minutes on the issue of dialing for dollars.
You can see them come and go from the call suites, both the Democratic headquarters and the Republican headquarters. And you can tell when members of Congress are missing in action. You know where they're at. Right? Look at how many members of Congress are not at hearings or not on the floor or are hard to find. And then I also know personal testimonies from colleagues, right? Colleagues who have told me they had to miss family vacation because there was an end of quarter deadline.
Do you think Americans realize how much time their members of Congress are spending raising money?
I don't. I think they know that there is too much money in politics, but the whole purpose of my STOP Act is to pull the curtain back on the amount of time that members of Congress spend raising money. In any other profession, if you spend 20 to 30 hours a week doing a job other than what you were hired, you'd be fired. But we've accepted this political culture that somehow it's acceptable and it's wrong.
Members spend so much time fundraising that they may not be able to spend as much time discerning the common good through deliberation and researching issues to craft well-thought-out laws. This has been a common complaint in recent years. Political scientists like myself are also concerned about the impact of money on politics, and relatedly, the ability of members to do their jobs, but for several additional reasons. Most broadly, we conduct studies to see if members of Congress provide representation to constituents differently based upon their incomes. We do this to determine whether economic inequalities translate into political inequalities via distortions in representation. In Unequal Democracy, Larry Bartels, a political scientist, presents one of the seminal studies on this issue, finding members of Congress are most responsive to the preferences of wealthy Americans across a variety of policy areas, ranging from minimum wage increases to abortion laws. Conversely, they are shown to be only somewhat responsive to the preferences of the middle class and not responsive at all to the preferences of the poorest Americans. Subsequent studies have confirmed most of these findings. My own research investigates whether political donors, rather than simply wealthy Americans in general, are causing House members to change their representative behavior in office. Likely as a consequence of their need to raise more campaign dollars, members of the House rely more and more upon funds provided by campaign contributors who live outside of their districts and states. But is this business as usual or a new development? Unfortunately, we face some data limitations here because of the way that the U.S. Federal Election Commission has campaigns report their contribution information. Political scientists have to use donors' zip codes and addresses to determine whether the money is coming to the campaign from inside or outside of a given congressional district. Since districts and zip code boundaries don't line up, and there are millions of contributions in any given election cycle, there are only a few cycles where we have performed this matching analysis. Political scientist Janet Grensky conducted one of the earliest studies on this issue. She reported that 45% of campaign contributions came to House races from outside of the district in the late 1970s, and that the percentage rose to 61% by the early 1980s. From my more recent study, we know that between 2008 and 2012, more than half of the House depended upon donor contributions for half of their campaign revenue, and around a quarter of these members are highly dependent upon out-of-the-district contributions, meaning 60% or more of their campaign receipts from donors are coming from outside of the candidate's home district. More recent data from the Center for Responsive Politics confirms that in the 2016 election, seated members of Congress, on average, raised at least 65% of donor contributions from non-constituents. This trend is potentially problematic if it interferes with representation. Members of the House are intended to be the most locally focused of all federal office holders, so any incentive to redirect their focus beyond their districts could detract from the representation they provide to their constituents. In the study I conducted on this issue, I discovered highly dependent members are less responsive to their constituents' opinion preferences, and that was when I measured those preferences in the broadest terms possible. Basically, if we think of representation as a Venn diagram with one circle for constituents and one circle for the representative, the hope and expectation in a democratic system of government is that those two circles would overlap considerably. Perhaps not perfectly, but considerably. However, in a series of statistical models testing this relationship, I find members who are dependent upon donor contributions from outside of their districts are less ideologically responsive to their constituents' ideological preferences. In other words, The overlap between the two circles diminishes with increasing amounts of money from outside of the district. In these models, I examine the overlap in ideologies rather than particular policies, because this is very much a baseline measure of generally how responsive the member is to constituents over a full term in Congress. Thus, the results are both surprising and a bit discouraging, because they suggest these members are being more responsive to donors than to their constituents, using a very basic measure of representation that leaves the member lots of wiggle room to diverge from constituents' preferences on some issues. Additionally, the members who received the most money from outside of their districts also tended to be among the more ideologically extreme members of the House. So, this trend may also relate to growing polarization in Congress. Only further studies will help determine whether this is the case. In light of this finding, it was important to examine the partisan and policy motivations of the people who make contributions to House candidates running in different parts of the country. What motivates these non-constituent donors? Figuring this out will help political scientists develop further tests of the impact donor preferences might have on representation provided by members of the House. When I closely examined the preferences of donors who give to House races nationwide using national survey data, I find these donors are politically sophisticated and strategic. They make contributions to multiple House candidates, and they do this irrespective of the partisanship of their own House member. Thus, it is likely not the case that donors contribute because they are represented by someone from the opposition party and want to back a substitute candidate to make sure their partisan preferences get represented in Congress. Rather, the results suggest they make political contributions to gain additional representation in Congress from multiple members. Moreover, when I examined their policy preferences, I found conservative policy preferences on issues ranging from climate change to gun laws are more likely to lead the donor to contribute outside of their home district than liberal policy preferences. This might be a consequence of the fact that liberal donors are known to be more likely to belong to interest groups, which may provide them with an alternative means of advocating their preferences. Further testing will be needed to achieve a complete picture of donor motivations. Yet these initial results provide me with new ways to evaluate representation in Congress. Gaining a better grasp of the preferences of donors enables political scientists then to determine the extent to which donors' policy preferences diverge from average voters' policy preferences, and whether specific policies are crafted by members of Congress primarily to serve donors' economic interests. The propagation of such knowledge is one way that studies like this serve a transformative social function and specifically address issues of economic injustice. At its heart, my research investigates the question of fairness on 3 different levels. First, do politicians give more weight to the preferences of some constituents over others? Second, if politicians give greater weight to certain constituents' preferences, does that calculus alter the decisions they make in office in ways that fundamentally advantage certain groups of citizens over others? And third, what is the impact of what may turn out to be biased representation on the functioning of democracy and our well-being as a nation? Does it lead to contentious political polarization? Does it result in partisan posturing and gridlock in Congress? Does it further entrench us in a trend of growing income inequality that has contributed to a shrinking and struggling middle class? Does it make public service a less appealing career option for our young people? The answers to these questions are stepping stones on a path that can allow us to discern what a just democratic society should look like and where we are headed as a country. If you're curious about the origins of your own House members' campaign contributions and want to see how dependent your member is on funds from donors who live outside of your district or state, there are resources that will allow you to conduct your own investigation. To illustrate how to do this, one of my students, Megan Hallisey, a senior here at SCU, is going to help us out. Hi, Megan. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
First, if you don't know who your House member is, the U.S. House of Representatives has a Find Your Representative tool on their website. Can you pull up their webpage, Megan, and tell us what you see?
Sure, no problem. I see a box where you can enter your zip code to discover who your House rep is.
Great, go ahead and do that.
Okay, I entered Ro Khanna. It looks like you can also find the contact information for your member of the House there.
Great. Next, to see your member's campaign finance data, let's have you go to opensecrets.org. This website is managed by the Center for Responsive Politics and uses data from House members' campaign finance reports. When you go to opensecrets.org, click on the Menu tab and select Congressional Elections. A box will appear on the left. You can enter your House member's name in the box or select the state where you live in the drop-down tab.
Okay, great. I chose to enter my former House Representative, Mike Honda. I clicked on his name, and when the page for the California 17th District House race opens, I can see how much money was raised and spent in my local House election. Then, if I click on the Geography tab, I'm also able to see how much money each candidate raised outside of California and outside of my congressional district if I scroll down.
What did you find?
In my case, Mike Honda raised 29% of his money outside of my state, and Ro Khanna raised 22% from outside of the state. But it also looks like both candidates received most of their money outside of my district from other parts of California.
Interesting. We don't have time at the moment, but you can examine many other aspects of your members' campaign fundraising on this page on the Open Secrets website. Next, Megan, you can go to votesmart.org to see your House members' issue stances and votes on different pieces of legislation. This website was created by Project VoteSmart.
When you get to the website, there appears to be a box at the top of the page where you can enter your House member's name.
Which name do you want to enter?
I entered Ro Khanna, who's my newly elected House member. After that, it looks like I can use the tabs at the top of the page to see key votes he cast, his issue positions, and endorsements from interest group organizations, and a lot of other information about him as well.
Great. Would you say that was easy?
Absolutely. It took only a few minutes of my time.
Thanks, Megan. You can replicate the searches Megan performed and take this information and contact your member of Congress via phone or by sending an email or a short postcard that addresses the issues that matter to you. The only way to ensure that our House members stay truly connected to their constituents is for all of us to get involved and voice our opinions. Members need to know our thoughts about what constitutes the common good. If we want them to be responsive to our preferences in a money-driven political marketplace, we need to take it upon ourselves to remind them that our votes matter just as much as the campaign contributions they are pressured to seek in order to successfully pay for the costs of running for re-election.
Thanks for listening to Integral, a Bannan Institute podcast of the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education at Santa Clara University. Special thanks to Professor Ann Baker for her contribution to today's episode, and for all the contributors to our second season. Join us again this fall for the launch of Season 3 of Integral, in which we'll be exploring issues of gender justice and the common good. Technical direction for Integral was provided by Craig Gower and Fern Silva. Our production manager is Kaylee Erickson. Thanks to Mike Whalen for advisory and editorial support. You can find us on the web at scu.edu/integral. or subscribe via iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, or Podbean.